For nearly a decade, Jordan Peterson has been one of the most recognizable voices in the world, a psychologist who built a global following by telling people to stand up straight, take responsibility, and face suffering head-on. But behind the lectures and the best-selling books, Peterson has spent years fighting battles of his own, battles that had almost nothing to do with ideas and everything to do with survival. In the summer of 2025, that private struggle became public again, when his family confirmed a diagnosis that explained years of declining health and forced one of the world's most outspoken thinkers to step back from the stage entirely. This is the story of how he got there. Jordan Peterson was born in 1962 and raised in Fairview, a small town in northern Alberta, Canada, where winters were long and entertainment was scarce. What the town lacked in excitement, it made up for in quiet, and quiet for a naturally curious child was fertile ground. His father worked as a teacher and his mother as a librarian, and the Peterson household treated books not as decoration, but as necessity. It was a modest, practical upbringing, but one that placed a premium on reading and reasoning. A local librarian named Sandy Notley steered the teenage Peterson toward writers who rarely make it onto a typical high school reading list. George Orwell, Aldous Huxley, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Ayn Rand. These weren't comforting books. They were meditations on tyranny, ideology, and the ways ordinary people participate in extraordinary cruelty. For a teenager in a small prairie town, wrestling with Solzhenitsyn's account of the Soviet Gulag system was not a typical pastime, but it planted a question in Peterson's mind that would define the rest of his career. Why do reasonable people so often end up serving unreasonable, even monstrous systems? Even before he left home, Peterson had developed a habit that would define his entire career. He did not accept easy answers. Classmates remember him as someone who would push back on a teacher's explanation, not to be difficult, but because he genuinely wanted to know whether the explanation actually held up. That instinct, paired with a household that treated intellectual effort as ordinary rather than exceptional, gave him an unusually early start on questions most people don't seriously grapple with until much later in life. Questions about why entire societies can slide into cruelty and what, if anything, an individual person can do about it. Like a lot of idealistic young people, Peterson initially looked for the answer in politics. He became involved with Canada's New Democratic Party as a teenager, drawn to its promises of fairness and social improvement. But the more history he read, the more he noticed an uncomfortable pattern. Political movements that promised liberation had a disturbing habit of producing new forms of control. By 18, he had walked away from party politics, not out of apathy, but because he'd concluded that the problem he was trying to solve wasn't really a policy problem. He enrolled at the University of Alberta, initially studying political science, then switched to psychology when he realized political theory could describe how systems worked without ever explaining why individual human beings chose to support them, even when those systems caused harm. That question carried him to McGill University, where he completed a PhD in clinical psychology, studying the roots of addiction and aggression, including what predisposes certain people toward alcoholism. It was detailed, unglamorous research, but it gave him a grounded, clinical understanding of human behavior that would later distinguish him from purely academic philosophers. From 1993 to 1998, Peterson taught and conducted research at Harvard University, where he built a reputation as an intense, demanding, but deeply engaging instructor. His focus was on personality, belief, and how people respond to stress and uncertainty, themes that would echo through the rest of his public work. Students who took his classes during this period often described him the same way. Someone who treated undergraduate seminars with the same seriousness most professors reserve for their own research, and who seemed genuinely invested in whether his students walked away thinking differently about their own lives. In 1998, he returned to Canada, joined the University of Toronto, and began seeing roughly 20 clinical patients a week alongside his teaching duties. That clinical work mattered. It meant Peterson wasn't only theorizing about anxiety and despair from a lecture podium. He was sitting across from people experiencing it directly, week after week, watching which ideas actually help someone get out of bed in the morning and which ones were just interesting in the abstract. Around this time, he also began weaving mythology, religious narrative, and philosophy into his psychology lectures, developing the distinctive style that would later make him famous. Long, winding lectures that connected ancient stories to modern clinical observations about responsibility, suffering, and order. All of it fed into his first book, Maps of Meaning. The Architecture of Belief, published in 1999 after 13 years of writing. It was a dense, difficult book that tried to explain how humans build systems of meaning out of stories and symbols, and how those systems shape everything from individual behavior to entire ideologies. At the time, almost no one outside academic circles read it. 2 decades later, it would become required reading for millions of people who first found Peterson through YouTube. Peterson's transformation from professor to global figure happened almost overnight, and it happened because of a piece of Canadian legislation most people had never heard of. In 2016, he posted a series of YouTube videos objecting to Bill C-16, a law that added gender identity and expression to Canada's human rights protections. Peterson's specific objection was narrow. He argued the law could be used to compel speech, forcing people to use particular pronouns under threat of legal consequence. And he framed this as a dangerous precedent for free expression, regardless of how well-intentioned the underlying goal was. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Protests broke out at the University of Toronto. Colleagues and students condemned him publicly. Others rallied to his defense. Depending on who was describing him, Peterson was either a principled defender of free speech or someone actively undermining protections for a vulnerable community. That controversy, rather than damaging his career, launched it into an entirely different orbit. His lecture videos, once watched by a few hundred students, were suddenly being viewed by millions of strangers around the world. The publication of 12 Rules for Life, an antidote to chaos, in 2018 cemented Peterson as a genuine publishing phenomenon. The book sold millions of copies and turned him into a fixture of international media. Podcasts, debates, sold-out auditoriums, back-to-back flights between continents. From the outside, it looked like effortless, tireless success. From the inside, it was closer to a slow-motion collapse. Around this period, Peterson adopted an extremely restrictive diet, eventually eating almost nothing but meat in an attempt to manage inflammation and mood symptoms he'd struggled with for years. Combined with a relentless travel and media schedule, the diet contributed to a kind of social isolation. He was constantly in front of audiences, yet increasingly cut off from the ordinary rhythms of rest and connection that keep most people stable. What almost no one knew at the time was that Peterson was also facing a second, far more personal crisis. In 2019, his wife, Tammy Peterson, was diagnosed with Bellini duct carcinoma, an extremely rare and aggressive form of kidney cancer with a grim prognosis. The diagnosis arrived while Peterson was near the peak of his public visibility, and it forced him to try to hold 2 entirely different lives together at once. The internationally recognized author giving interviews and lectures, and the husband quietly preparing for the possibility of losing his wife. The stress took a physical toll. Peterson began experiencing severe anxiety and insomnia and was prescribed clonazepam, a benzodiazepine commonly used for anxiety disorders. Benzodiazepines can be effective in the short term, but they carry a well-documented risk of dependence with prolonged use, a risk that isn't always obvious until a person tries to stop taking them. Over time, and while continuing to juggle a demanding international schedule, Peterson's body became dependent on the medication in ways that weren't apparent until he attempted to reduce his dose. What followed, by his family's own public accounts, was one of the most dangerous periods of Peterson's life. Benzodiazepine withdrawal can trigger severe physical and neurological symptoms, and in Peterson's case, it became unmanageable through conventional treatment in North America. His family eventually pursued treatment abroad, in Russia, where doctors placed him in a medically induced coma, an aggressive intervention intended to help his body get through withdrawal without the full conscious experience of the accompanying distress. While hospitalized, Peterson also developed pneumonia, adding a serious infection on top of an already severely compromised system. After the coma, he spent time in intensive care and had to relearn basic motor coordination. Tasks as simple as walking or holding objects steadily had to be rebuilt through slow, deliberate rehabilitation. It was a stark contrast to the man who, only months earlier, had been striding across stages in front of thousands of people. When Peterson resurfaced publicly in 2020, the change was visible immediately. He was thinner, his voice had lost some of its familiar sharpness, and he moved with noticeably more caution. Rather than returning with a triumphant relaunch, he chose to talk about what had happened, appearing in a series of recorded conversations with his daughter, Michaela, in which he described the benzodiazepine dependence, the withdrawal, and the coma in Russia with unusual candor for someone who had built a public identity around discipline and self-control. There was, amid all of this, a genuine piece of good news. Tammy Peterson's cancer, against a devastating initial prognosis, went into remission. For a family that had spent more than a year under the shadow of a likely terminal diagnosis, her recovery offered a rare and welcome sense of relief. In 2021, Peterson published Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life, a sequel with a noticeably different tone from his first bestseller. Less concerned with imposing structure, more attentive to the dangers of becoming too rigid, and more willing to sit with uncertainty. Not long after, he resigned his tenure position at the University of Toronto, ending a multi-decade academic career, and shifted his energy toward independent media, joining the Daily Wire and later launching Peterson Academy, an online education platform built outside traditional university structures. For a while, it looked as though Peterson had found a sustainable rhythm again, still prolific, still controversial, but no longer running on the punishing schedule that had helped break him down in 2019. Then, in the summer of 2025, everything changed again. According to a public statement from his daughter, Michaela Fuller, Peterson had actually been dealing with the roots of a serious illness since around 2017, though it took years to get a name for it. In August 2025, while helping clean out her late grandfather's house after his passing, Peterson was exposed to what Michaela described as a particularly moldy environment. For most people, that kind of exposure might cause temporary irritation. For Peterson, it triggered a severe flare of an underlying condition his family says he'd been quietly managing for years: chronic inflammatory response syndrome, or CRS. CRS, as some clinicians describe it, occurs in people with a specific genetic susceptibility, estimated at around a quarter of the population, that leaves the immune system unable to properly identify and clear certain biotoxins produced by mold and bacteria in water-damaged buildings. Instead of